If you've been watching anime for any amount of time, one genre that has come up quite a lot, for better or worse, is the isekai genre. Each season's fans groan or celebrate as they dig through the releases and find that on top of the myriad battle shonen rom-coms, and sequels, is a whole heaping helping of isekai anime ready to spread their wings and fly. Whether it's being reincarnated to live a life in peace after working themselves literally to death, being placed in their favorite video game to live out the power fantasy they always aspire towards, or if they get thrown into a life of mishaps and misery and use all of their knowledge of the real world in order to succeed, you throw a rock into the ocean of anime, manga, light novels, and chances are you'll hit about a dozen isekai. Whether fans like it or not, isekai has become one of the most dominant genres in all of Japanese media. But how did it get to that point? Where did all of this begin? And more importantly for my audience and viewership, how did a subgenre of an already oversaturated genre become the dominant genre of a demographics adaptations? That's right, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. This week we'll be tackling the ever-growing trend of Otome Isekai, and how they've slowly but surely shaped the future of shoujo to come. But before we can reach the present, we need to travel back to the past, because the relationship between shoujo and isekai is one that dates back to almost half a century ago. But before I do that, a change of outfit is necessary. One moment. There. Now that I'm properly dressed for the occasion, let's dive into the history of the isekai genre. The idea of traveling to another world has been omnipresent in literature for thousands of years. Some credit the Greeks and Romans, whose heroes of old would travel to the underworld or be lured into another realm by a malicious entity. Or we could talk about Dante's 14th century classic, The Divine Comedy, in which Dante himself travels through each of the circles of hell, into purgatory, and eventually paradise. Or we could even talk about something like Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, or The Wizard of Oz, all of which were released in the mid-1800s going into the turn of the century. While all of these could lay claim to popularizing, revolutionizing, or even creating the genre, it starts to border on the cheeky and pretentious if I lean too heavily on those. You could dig through the annals of history and popular culture all you want to find the answer you're looking for. But ultimately, this entire discussion is primarily about the Japanese term that roughly translates to another world. So where in Japan did that story originally begin? A lot of people, when going to the idea of Japanese isekai, go to the tale of Urashima Taro, a story of a fisherman who rescues a turtle and is transported to a palace beneath the sea. When he returns home, he finds it has been 100 years since he was on the surface, and upon opening up a box given to him by the princess, he becomes an old man. The story has been passed around, retold, reinterpreted, and adapted since the 8th century, with a 1918 version being one of the first anime ever created in Japan. Technically, it's closer to the 10th or 11th feature, but a lot of the pre-World War II history of anime and manga is fairly vague, especially after a 1923 earthquake destroyed nearly every animated film created up to that point, as well as most Japanese films in general. As of right now, only 4% of Japanese cinema created before World War II even exists at all, so it's a little bit of a gray area. Still, when you add everything up all together, and then toss in some of the later works, like Peter Pan, Chronicles of Narnia, alongside all the other aforementioned media, you can see why this started to gain some traction in the mid-20th century, when people who grew up on these fairy tales wanted to tell stories of their own. It's around the end of the 60s going into the 70s that we first start to see the intersection between shoujo and isekai, a dance that has lasted for over 50 years. You see, Tezuka Osamu, the creator of Astro Boy, and to many the grandfather of manga itself, had wanted to establish two very distinct demographics in the 50s, all the way through the 60s. Those two demographics, shonen and shoujo. While I could take a deep dive into the history of manga, I feel like that would be too much of a tangent from the original point I'm trying to make here. Considering I did do my senior thesis on manga and got a master's in Japanese with a minor in Japanese history, I would love to eventually do a deep dive on the topic of manga history itself, especially in regard to shoujo, but for now I'll kind of do a bullet point version so we can get back to the timeline. Maybe if this video gets 1,000 views, I'll start working on that as one of my December pieces, but for right now, I digress. Before 1969, pretty much all manga was written and drawn exclusively by men, even books that fell into the shoujo demographic. As dire as that might sound to a modern audience, Tezuka himself did do a lot of good when he created Princess Knight, a story about a person born with both a male and a female soul, who rejected societal and gender norms in order to save the day. Tezuka and later Yokoyama Mitsuru, the father of the magical girl genre, were a lot more progressive than you might think, so when the Magnificent 24s, a group of female mangaka led by Rosa Versailles creator Ryoko Ikeda, came in trying to bring a female voice and gaze to the medium, there wasn't much pushback. In fact, most people were okay with this. One of the defining themes of shoujo was love, but more than that, the edict was placed that the protagonist must deal with some sort of adversity and conflict, but solve their issues with empathy, heroism, or adventure, even when the world seems at its darkest. Taking that edict, two books were released in 1975 and 1976 respectively that took that idea, but placed the hero in an alien, unknown, or otherwise mysterious place and had them find a way to survive. In essence, being transported to another world or another place. An isekai. Those books were They Were 11 and Crest of the Royal Family. They Were 11 dealt with a group of space cadets being sent off into the unknown in order to survive their final test on a decommissioned spaceship. The only issue is that there were 10 cadets that entered the ship, but 11 people on board. With the mission getting tenuous and tensions on the rise, they need to figure out who the imposter is if they hope to survive. Admittedly, I almost said suss them out, but you probably heard that synopsis and figured out pretty quickly what it would later go on to influence. I mean, the imposter narrative is one that has existed for quite some time, and John Carpenter's classic Thing is probably a more comparable example, but this was one of the first manga to send someone off to another place or another world and try to survive. The one, though, that I really like, and one that's really stuck with me, is Crest of the Royal Family. That was released a year later, and it would be a bit more of a literal example if you need your isekai to be a direct transport instead of a implied or symbolic one. In that series, the main character, Carol Reed, is sent back 3,000 years to ancient Egypt after being cursed by a tomb of a young pharaoh, and in it she uses her wits, brains, and knowledge of Egyptology to become known as the Daughter of the Nile, Guardian of Egypt. This series will be used later to kind of tie this whole video together, so I won't go into too much detail until then. But if you haven't yet had a chance to check out this classic, please do. Even at 67 volumes, it feels like a pretty brisk read. A lot of people love to talk trash about how shoujo is stagnant or lacks variety. But if you ever go back and read those shoujos from the 70s going into the 80s, there is a lot of variety in there, especially when it comes to sci-fi, action, thrillers, and even isekai. While a lot of people like to credit Dirty Pair creator Takehiko Haruka for creating the first modern isekai with the novel Warrior from Another World, shoujo manga had already had its claws in the genre for almost 5 years. Jumping over to the anime side of things, the first two that I could find that directly incorporated the isekai genre were the mecha television series Aura Battler Dunbine and the Super Mario Bros. Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach movie. The latter of which was, believe it or not, the first isekai to involve being trapped in a video game. So, sorry to say it, Sword Art Online and .hack fans who've been going back and forth, Mario's had you beat for about 15 years. The trend of shoujo manga and novels written for women utilizing the isekai genre continued well on into the 90s, and only seemed to pick up steam from there, where we got at least 5 real heavy hitters that all debuted within a 3-year period. Those series: Fushigi Yugi, Magical Knight Rayearth, Far From Away, Red River, and 12 Kingdoms, the last of which is a novel. Each of those series brought something unique to the table, and if you ask a lot of shoujo fans, they remain some of the most beloved series to this day. Shonen did start to dip its toes in the isekai sand a little bit with the release of Inuyasha, a series that, for me at least, remains one of my personal favorites to this day, but isekai throughout the 90s belonged almost exclusively to shoujo. I could honestly do a video on each of the 90s heavy hitters, since there's a lot to unpack with each of them, especially Far From Away, a series I only read recently thanks to a book club I'm in, but has quickly become one of my favorites. But, for the sake of this video, the one I'll be focusing mostly on is Fushigi Yugi, which will act as sort of a linchpin for the entire concept as it begins to narrow down. Fushigi Yugi follows Miyaka and Yui, who find a book called The Universe of the Four Gods, which, upon reading, transports them into the world of the book. Miyaka ends up trapped and becoming the priestess of Suzaku, destined to gather the 7 celestial warriors, gain favor of the 4 guardian beasts, and ultimately summon Suzaku themselves in order to gain 3 wishes. Yui escapes the book almost immediately and devises a plan to get Miyaka back by reading the book herself, but ultimately gets sent back when things go awry. She has some very bad things happen to her in a short amount of time after returning that I won't go into all too much, but she essentially gets tricked into believing that Miyaka is the villain and that she's the cause of all her misfortune. So she joins up with the Seiryu clan and becomes one of their priestesses in order to stop Miyaka and get with Tamahome, Miyaka's love interest, because, well, let's be honest, he's a very hot guy and she wants to be with him herself. Iwatase, the author behind Fushigi Yugi, had grown up reading manga and enjoying making art themselves, though it wasn't until high school that they really started digging into the training side of things and began pursuing a career in the medium. Watase was a fan of Chinese mythology, as well as 70s and 80s shoujo manga in which people were transported to a different world. So it made sense that Fushigi Yugi was one of their first series, beginning publication in the start of 1992. The series ran until 1996, with an anime releasing in the mid-90s as well, and the series gained quite the following in the years to come, releasing video games, spin-offs, sequels, and recently celebrated its 30-year anniversary. While not at the forefront of popularity in the same way as Sailor Moon, Pokemon, or Dragon Ball Z, which were beginning to or in the middle of their initial Western takeover, anybody who read series like Fushigi Yugi, Red River, or any of the aforementioned titles found something to love. Not to put it so bluntly, but a lot of guys wanted to watch things explode and see action on their television screens with bright colors, interesting set pieces, and things they could reenact on the school playground. I'm not trying to generalize here, but as somebody born at the start of the 90s, I saw all of this unfold in real time. As much as I enjoyed all of the big, fun action shonen, I was also the kind of kid that loved to read, and wasn't too big into Western comics, save for Spider-Man and X-Men. More often than not, I found myself reading and joining book clubs with other manga readers, and 9 times out of 10, it was usually all women, myself included. So I became acutely aware of all of these fantastic shoujo series early on, though if I asked any of the boys in the class, they would often respond with the usual, "Why would I read something for girls?" or "Why read when I can watch?" Still, while a lot of variety existed and came out at a breakneck pace, it was a bit slower along the Western front at first, with kids and teens like myself taking what we were given and running with it to the best of our abilities throughout that early anime and manga boom. The market at that time wasn't oversaturated, and everything seemed new, cool, and fresh. Even if certain scenarios were recycled, reused, or felt overly familiar, nobody really batted an eye because it was still so niche over here in the US. We were so taken by the style of storytelling, the likes of which you rarely saw in Western animation or in Western comics, that we would eat everything up that we could. Still, regardless of whether it was at the forefront of popularity or not, companies like Viz and Tokyopop were releasing a ton of material, with the isekai genre being a large part of that. Interestingly enough, while I was working on research for the script, it became apparent that a gateway anime that a lot of people enjoyed and to this day is still the only anime to ever win an Oscar was an isekai. Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away got a lot of people interested in anime who weren't already involved in that world, and it wasn't until years later, in hindsight, that people realized what genre it belonged to. Still, as popular as Spirited Away and the aforementioned series in the 90s to the early 2000s were, it wasn't until a few years after the release of Spirited Away that the genre began to take off in earnest, and it was all thanks to a single website. You see, in 2004, a website called Shoshutko no Naro, or Naro for short, was launched online as a way for people to write their own stories and publish them free of charge, with no paywall separating the reader from the author. Think Wattpad, but good. While the original Sword Art Online web novel was self-published on the author's website, it was Naro that really turned the tide for isekai novelizations with the debut of Familiar of Zero. The popularity of that series alone, and its myriad fanfictions throughout the 2000s, led to the rise of more isekai on the platform, namely Land of Leedale, Knights and Magic, and Saga of Tanya the Evil in 2010, Mushoku Tensei and Re:Zero in 2012, and Konosuba in 2013. There were a lot more, obviously, but those were the big ones to really come right at the start of all of that. Those series, which are regarded as some of the most influential modern works of the genre, all began on Naro. Mushoku Tensei, much like Familiar of Zero before it, became the catalyst of 2010's light novels. And it's partially thanks to that series' popularity that we have a large amount of the tropes, nuances, and outlines of what makes an isekai today. Whether you like the content of the series or not, and I completely understand if people don't like Mushoku Tensei, it's regarded highly in the community for a reason. One defining aspect that Leedale, Tanya, Knights of Magic introduced that would later be duplicated in Mushoku Tensei for a wider audience was the debut of the reincarnation plotline. Now, mind you, The World Exists for Me, a 2-volume shoujo released in 2001, did flirt with the idea of dying and being reincarnated. But technically, it was those Naro light novels that really sunk their teeth into the trope and made it as what you see today. You see, most isekai can be neatly placed into one of two categories. Either you are whisked away to a magical land, somewhere in the distant past or future, or some alternate place or timeline different than the real world, usually either due to circumstance, magic, or some sort of outside entity, or you die and wake up in another world, either thanks to the benevolence of a deity, sheer luck, or your consciousness being saved inside a video game. Regardless, it is one of those two starting actions that define what kind of isekai you'll be getting. Throughout the history of the genre and going into the 2010s, it was defined almost wholly and completely by the former, though in the 12 years since then, the latter has become the dominant force, even coining the cute pseudo-character Truck-kun, known for hitting unsuspecting high school students and sending them to an early grave. It's become so prevalent that a lot of people now aren't sure whether a story is truly an isekai if the person doesn't die and is reincarnated. But why is that? And why has one of the newer Truck-kun replacements as of late been working yourself literally to death? Well, to answer that question, you need to look at Kuroshi Guaroso or Guarashi. I could be ruining that last one, but I'm not great with Chinese. Either way, all three mean the same thing in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. Working yourself to death. Since the 1960s, this has been an issue that seemingly refuses to go away, and has actually become much worse as the years have gone on. If you ever stop to think why a lot of anime feature high school kids outside of the obvious demographic reasons, you'll notice that for a lot of people in Eastern countries, high school is the pinnacle of your existence. The high point at which you can never hope to reach again unless you find success in the entertainment industry. Even then, idol culture, mangaka, voice actors, and animators all deal with their own various degrees of unrest. So even if you do make it there, it's not a guarantee you'll be happy again. More often than not, you'll finish high school, go to college, and then spend the rest of your life being a cog in the machine until you eventually die or retire or both. High school was the last hope, and now they're making up for it as best as they can, which can often lead to an early death from working too many hours. Some steps have been made recently to try and curb the phenomena, but if you've ever wondered why so many manga, manhwa use the isekai genre as a means of inspiration, a way to escape, or why it's become so saturated, well, now you know. It could also be greed. I mean, I'm pessimistic enough to realize that all of this could be based on the fact that the genre prints money. But I'd like to think that there is more there. Work culture, especially as of late, has always been a sticky subject for many. And I find that when people really want to be creative, they base some of it on their own personal experiences. As much as the pessimist in me believes it's money-driven, when you have so many people writing from the same starting point, usually there's some sort of truth there. Going back to the timeline, however, it was in 2012 that we got the anime adaptation for Sword Art Online. Whether you love the series or you despise it with every fiber of your being, it was a major cultural milestone. It was a money-printing megastar that caused the already popular isekai genre Naro to explode even further than it already had. When you mix the juggernaut that was Sword Art Online with the enigma that was Mushoku Tensei, it was a powder keg of creativity and copying. It even coined the phrase officially in the anime sphere. And when anime studios and executives saw that there were all these stories that could be adapted and turned in for a quick buck, the isekai genre officially took off in the world of anime and manga on top of web novels and light novels. Everywhere you turned, there was at least one isekai coming out. And now it's probably one of the most oversaturated markets in all of entertainment. Heck, there are so many works out there nowadays that oftentimes light novel authors will use the title as the synopsis to get people to read the book. That's how we ended up with all of these ridiculous titles that have become the butt of the light novel community. It's also where our story diverges into something a little bit more focused, or I should say when the story reunites once again with the shoujo and female demographic. You see, in 2013, there was a story called My Motto is Living Honestly and Humbly. A story about a girl who wakes up in her favorite shoujo manga, but this time she's the villain of the story. After realizing that she's destined to head towards her bad end that will lead her and her family to complete and utter ruin, she decides to do everything she can to prevent that from happening, while also trying to create a safety net in case things go wrong. Thankfully, she's already read the entire series, so she should be safe as long as she avoids her doom flags, right? Well, what happens though once the original story starts to deviate? Who is the real villain once the old villain recants? And what will you do once the manga is over? The series was a hit on Naro, remaining at the number 13 spot on the highest rated novels to this day, despite never having much of a presence outside of the website. But it was in the spring of 2014 that we really got the origin story of what would become the defining subgenre of the female demographic light and web novels that would go on to create a renaissance that we're still feeling the ripples of to this day. That series, the one that codified this entire thing, My Next Life as a Villainess, All Paths Lead to Doom. This story would be quite similar to my motto in many ways, but this time instead of focusing on a girl who dies and is reincarnated as the villainess of her favorite shoujo manga, she is reincarnated into her favorite Otome game. There's no definitive proof one way or another whether motto-inspired villainess or it was just the case of two people having similar ideas and releasing them close to one another, but their combined effort in that 2-year period really helped things take off. Now, for a bit of a brief detour, since there are probably some of you out there who have no idea what an Otome game is. Otome games, for the uninitiated, are a series of visual novel titles that usually focus on a girl as she tries to navigate life and eventually woo the fictional man, men, or even women of her dreams. Ruby Party, an offshoot of Koei, later Koei Tecmo, started by Keiko Arakawa, took her love of 70s and 80s shoujo manga and wanted to give female players a chance to experience something like that in interactive form, believing that video game companies were refusing to cater to a female audience and leaving money on the table. It took 10 years of trying and recruiting an all-female staff of developers, but eventually, in 1994, they released Angelique, which would become the foundation for what would later become coined as the Otome game. They successfully created a game that was made for the female gaze and dealt with the intricacies of love, intimacy, heartbreak, betrayal, and yes, even rivals who wanted to undermine you any chance they could get. These rivals in the games were very similar to shoujo antagonists of years past, and would go on to help shape the archetype for what would later become known as the villainous trope. Ruby Party would continue to release games, as well as many other different tie-ins, including novels, manga, audio dramas, and even stage play adaptations, and, believe it or not, they're still going strong to this day. Needless to say, there's a lot of variation in the genre, from time travel to being whisked away to another world, to solving murders, to any sort of scenario you can think of within the genre. Fushigi Yugi even got its own Otome game, which ended up being wildly popular in the late 2000s. Even to this day, the genre is still incredibly popular on mobile, PC, and even the Nintendo Switch. Go turn on your Switch right now if you have one, and go and look. You'll find at least 1 or 2 Otome games released every month. Some are mediocre, admittedly, but the amount of fantastic Otome games you can play on the go is astounding. So with that knowledge and history behind it, why not bring everything full circle? Shoujo inspired Otome, so why not make shoujo that utilize Otome tropes? Why not blend it all together and even throw in the ever-growing isekai genre? There was already a ton of history and shared DNA there, so it all seemed like peanut butter and jelly. And Villainous tapped into that. And it was thanks to that series that so many more got released on Naro, and the process dripped down even further into other mediums as well. It blew up massively. But unless you were deep in the Otome Isekai sphere, the light novel sphere, or were living in or knowledgeable about Japanese publishing, you probably didn't know all that much if you lived in the West. you might have some peripheral knowledge, or maybe you heard about a story, or you saw a manga in passing, or maybe you knew of an anituber or manga tuber that talked about it with some sort of excitement. But if I'm being completely honest, by the time the 2010s were wrapping up, people were starting to get sick of isekai and wish they would just go away, since all they did was clog up a seasonal anime release calendar, and we're now starting to clog up manga release calendars as well. That's not even counting the manhwa and webtoon side of things, which exploded in popularity in the mid-2010s and released a ton of amazing series that fit both into the isekai and Otome Isekai genre. Heck, some of the best stories I've ever read in the genre came from manhwa, but it's only within the last few years we've started to see some of them come stateside, and even fewer have gotten anime adaptations. Then 2020 and the pandemic happened, and one of the shows Crunchyroll was pushing at the start of lockdown was the anime adaptation of My Next Life as a Villainess, and once again, Katarina Clays, whether she knew it or not, proved to be more valuable than she had any idea. Whether by happenstance, luck, corporate design, or people stuck at home needing something to watch, Villainous became a massive hit with audiences in the West. From its catchy opening, to its likable characters, to its unique bisexual reverse harem, all of the things that made the series one of my favorite light novels to read seemed to resonate with viewers of all sorts. Even those that refused to ever read shoujo or josei or watch anything that could be perceived as girly seemed to really love this show if they gave it a shot. It got so popular that it was almost immediately renewed for a second season, as well as a series of shorts following the different chibi parts of her brain. And while the second season wasn't as well received, it was still incredibly popular, and shortly after its release, a film was announced to be released in 2023. It became a license to print money due to its broad appeal, and both the manga and light novel continue to sell really, really well. In fact, I would not be surprised if after the movie they announce a third season a la Konosuba, because there is still so much unadapted material for them to work with. Either way, due to the massive popularity the show garnered during its first season, shortly after its release, news started to come out that maybe other light novels and manga that featured the villainous type character or took place in an Otome game would be getting anime adaptations themselves. Not only that, but those aforementioned light novels and manga would be coming to the West at quite a brisk pace. While you could easily blame some of it on the manga boom over the last 2 years, it's definitely telling that after the success of Villainous that we'd be getting as many Otome Isekai as we have. Even fan translations have picked up quite the fervor, which is how I was able to read in their entirety 158 published series, meaning manga, web novel, light novel, webtoon, manhwa. I mean, there's probably a lot more, and that's not even dipping into the Chinese market. All I'm saying is I read almost 160 different series. There could be a lot more I'm unaware of, but the fact in 9 years there have been at least 160 or almost 160, and most of them or all of them have been translated to some extent or have received some sort of English release, either physically or digitally, is telling. But why did I read all of that? Well, I'm thorough if nothing else, but mainly because I wanted to figure out the basic formula for what makes a good Otome Isekai. After reading as many as I have, I think I have a solution, or at least a working theory, and it boils down to 3 elements. Number 1, emotional intelligence. Having characters, whether main or supporting, who have agency in their own situation and can respond rationally and reasonably is incredibly important. It also comes in handy once you start adding romance to the equation. I understand that certain classic tropes are fun or hallmarks of the genre, but having characters who know what they want, how they want to get it, and having the depth to go through with it is paramount to a good story. Katarina being a black hole of denseness is fun, but if every character is like that, it gets old quickly and can easily sink a series. Number 2. Competent and compelling world building. It's one thing to have good characters, but I need to care about the world they're in as well. What is the conflict? Is there a war? What about demons, humans, and magic? What drives the characters, both main and supporting, to do what they must in order to survive? You can just say shoujo manga or otome games, but just listing off a bunch of tropes will get you nowhere. You need to make me care about what's going on in the world. Otherwise, good characterization will only get you so far. And in that same vein, don't make it too dense either. Sometimes too much info is just as bad as not enough. And number 3, empathy. Much like the other two, this one should seem self-explanatory, but you need to care about the characters and give us a reason to care about the relationships. Not just that, but make us care about their lives before. Did they want to go back? Did they die? Do they have regrets? What drove them? What motivated them in their previous life? How did their real-world experiences tie into what they're experiencing now? Why should we, the reader, care about the relationships in the story? What conflict comes up, and how can we, the audience, relate? Even the littlest things can grab a reader or a viewer and entice them to keep going. So, much like shoujo manga as a whole, empathy is important. Obviously, there's a lot of other smaller nuances that can make or break a series, but after reading so many of these, it really boils down to those 3 as to what makes a series truly memorable. As of this recording, we are about halfway through the fall season and heading into winter 2023. One of the big series that's catching a lot of buzz that's not Bleach, Mob Psycho, Chainsaw Man, My Hero Academia, or Spy Family is I'm the Villainess, so I'm taming the final boss. This series, in a lot of ways, is similar to My Next Life as a Villainess, but has created its own niche quite well, and has become incredibly popular to anybody that's given it a chance. Out of all the shoujo series this season, it's probably the one most likely to get a second season, and while I personally prefer Raven of the Inner Court overall as a series, you can definitely make an argument for why Taming the Final Boss is as popular as it is. Heck, I base my dress for this episode on my favorite Eileen look so far. What sets it apart, and this might be getting into mini-review territory, is its whip-smart, self-aware writing. Characters that feel incredibly fleshed out, and more than anything, the central relationship between Claude and Eileen, as well as Eileen herself, are incredibly endearing. Claude could have easily been the stoic, unmoving demon lord that you see in some other series, but the fact that he allows himself to be vulnerable and show how much he really cares is sweet. A dark tsundere boy with a heart of gold will always be good in my book. And when you have a character like Eileen, who could have easily been a Katarina ripoff, use her cunning and her bravery to solve problems rationally, while still not being afraid to color outside the lines of morality if need be, is really good. Together, they are a great pair, and the supporting cast is fantastic, from the humans all the way down to the other demons. The pacing is great, which I get is kind of controversial to some, but for me, the pacing is great. The writing is superb, and while I wish the manga would have continued past the first book, I'm glad the anime has been sticking to the 4-episode per book format. Obviously, some may not like that it takes that approach, since they're cutting some things out and it can feel rushed to anybody who's never read the light novels, but for me, it hits that perfect balance and I absolutely adore it. It fits the bill of the 3 elements perfectly, and that's why I'm hoping it continues in some fashion. At the rate they're going now, they could be caught up to the series by the end of Season 2 going into a movie, so it seems like free money left on the table if they don't. While I'm on that subject, I'll just rapid fire a few other series that I think you should be reading, and if you want me to make a bonus video list or mini reviews of some sort, one of my down weeks between these essays, I'll be more than happy to. I already said if I got 1,000 views, I'll do a history of manga video, so if this gets, 3,000 views, I will do a list on my favorite Otome Isekai manga, manhwa, webtoons, and, actually put these in a top 10 order and go deep into detail on each one of them. Heck, if this video somehow explodes in popularity and gets 5,000, I might just do a history of manhwa and webtoons, since I really love the culture there as well, and feels like it's not really being talked about enough. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'd really like to dig into that. Well, either way, though, here's some rapid-fire recommendations before I start wrapping up with the future and the one tie-in I mentioned at the beginning. So, obviously this isn't in any official top 10 format, but here are the 10 series. Accomplishments of the Duke's Daughter, I'm in Love with the Villainess, Beatrice, I Took a Trip to an Otome Game, Lady Rose Wants to Be a Commoner, Ebony, Your Throne, Cross-Dressing Villainess Cecilia Sylvie, I'll Never Be Your Crown Princess, and Daughter of the Emperor. I'm already running incredibly long, so I can't do a review, and like I've said many times now, this isn't a actual listed top 10, but these are the 10 series that I would recommend if, you have nowhere to start on the whole Otome Isekai genre. Read these 10 as well as Villainous, and you'll pretty much have a really good idea of what to look for when you're going into the Otome Isekai genre. With that out of the way, let's look towards the future. Now, if you look ahead to 2023, you'll see that there are a fair amount of Otome Isekai on the horizon. A lot of people want to talk about the decline of shoujo anime, and while the high school rom-com slice of life has been taken over by shonen and seinen, which will get its own video somewhere down the line, but I'm not putting any more milestones on anything, shoujo has seemed to find a comfortable niche in the fantasy genre, especially in the Otome Isekai variety. We could still definitely do with more than just 5 to 10 series a year, especially when shonen and seinen outnumber shoujo and josei almost 20 to 1, if not more. And the deep-rooted sexism and misogyny in the industry as a whole certainly isn't helping much either, and let's be honest, it's not going anywhere either. But the fact that the demographic has found a genre that is bringing them massive success once again opens the door for more traditional series to be released as well. All of these Otome Isekai are leading to other series getting their due. Series like Ice Guy and his cool female colleague, Loving Yamada at level 999, or historical dramas like Bibliophile Princess are getting opportunities to have adaptations and be seen by people when I don't even think this would have been a possibility 3 or 5 years ago. It's amazing and gives me hope that maybe things are on the upswing for shoujo anime after almost a decade of being on a downturn. I have one last little bit, though, that I want to get off my chest before I finish this video. Now that we've talked about the future, now that we've talked about the history, this is getting into a little bit of that's just a theory, a shoujo theory, but I think it's a good way to tie everything all together. Remember how, towards the beginning of the video, I said that I would get back to Crest of the Royal Family, the 1970s shoujo isekai about the girl in Egypt? How there would be one interesting aspect that would weave shoujo's influence on isekai throughout history, leading into the Otome Isekai, and put a nice, neat little bow on it? Well, here it is. Isis. Isis is the sister of Memphis, who is the pharaoh that Carol befriends once she's swept back into Egypt. Isis is the villainess. Not just is the villainess, as in she's the one of the main antagonists of the series, but if you actually sit down and read the series, she is everything that would make up the villainous archetype. She is the trope, or, she's at least the building blocks, if nothing else, that would lead to what would eventually become the villainous archetype. Obviously, not the redeemable, fun aspects like a Katarina or an Eileen, especially when 99.9% of her motivation is wanting to sleep with her brother and kill Carol, but reading through the entire thing, you can really see how this character would go on to influence shoujo villains in the years to come. Interestingly enough, as you may have picked up throughout the history portion of the video, a lot of the authors and creators of series that would go on to be a massive influence in the creation of both Otome games and the Otome Isekai subgenre grew up reading books like Crest of the Royal Family. So, ultimately, a side character in a 70s shoujo isekai would later be used as the inspiration for another character archetype in a video game genre that, along with 90s shoujo isekai that would get its own Otome spinoff, would lead to a new subgenre of isekai in the mid-2010s that may or may not have taken inspiration from another novel about a girl reincarnated in a shoujo manga who based her writings on classic shoujos from back in the day, and the combined efforts of all of those different elements would lead to a slew of new shoujo and josei series that would then be greenlit for anime adaptations thanks to the aforementioned series becoming a massive hit in 2020 during the pandemic. Now, I realize that a lot of that run-on sentence may not make any sense and it's really just a theory, but still, let me sum it up as best as I can without sounding like Charlie talking about Pepe Sylvia. Shoujo and isekai are intertwined and have been for over 50 years. The fact that this long-standing partnership is now coming into its fullest potential and helping shift the balance of shoujo anime in our favor once again seems appropriate. I don't see either trend ending anytime soon either, but with the quality of most of these releases being as good as they are, I can't complain. The world has a funny way of working sometimes, and it doesn't always make sense. But when those dominoes fall right into place or things line up just in the right way, it can be incredibly satisfying. Such is the tale of shoujo and isekai and the Otome subgenre they created. Hey everybody, Kenzie here. So I realize this is a very long video to do for my second video, but this is something that it won on the Twitter poll. I don't know if Twitter's down yet by the time this is coming out, but, RIP if so. But this was something that was voted on, and is something that I'm very passionate about. But while my original script was only about 4 or 5 pages, the same length as the Romantic Killer one, right as I was finishing it, I found out that there was another person making a Otome Isekai video. So, I wanted to take that concept of the Otome Isekai and really expand it. Because Colleen is a fantastic essayist. I'm not trying to kiss her ass here, but she is fantastic at what she does. There's a reason why she's the foremost shoujo YouTuber on the entire platform. She is good at what she does, and she knows what she's talking about. And me, I know a lot about history. And so I wanted to take what I know about history and kind of dance around a little bit of what was already there, and I wanted to take what I kind of figured she would do. I didn't see her video. These videos are coming out on the same time at the same day, but I wanted to take my side of it and kind of mix it with her side of it so that if you watch Colleen's video and then you watch my video, you can get 2 different things out of it. And now there's even a third person who I will link down below who will be doing an Otome Isekai video who's bringing something else to the table. I think that it's not bad for people to do the same kind of videos, so I want to be able that, all of this can exist on the same platform at once. So, long rant over. Watch Colleen's video, watch my video, watch the other video coming out, and if you like this, be sure to share it everywhere. I don't know what platforms are still around anymore, but just share them everywhere you can. Like, subscribe, share this once again. And until then, I will see you guys next time, and make sure to keep on reading.